The diner sat at the edge of town, its neon sign buzzing weakly against the early evening sky. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where families came for pancakes on Sundays, and tired workers nursed black coffee after long shifts. On the surface, nothing about it felt unusual, yet there was something heavy in the air that night. The booths were mostly empty, the floor creaked with each step, and the soft hum of the jukebox filled the silence. The smell of fried food lingered, mixing with the faint scent of old leather from the seats. To anyone passing by, it looked like any other small-town diner. To those inside, it would become the beginning of a story that no one would forget. At a corner table, an elderly couple sat quietly, their hands close but not quite touching. Their clothes were plain, worn down by time, yet there was a dignity in the way they carried themselves. Their faces told stories of years lived, of hardships endured, and of a bond that had lasted longer than most. They looked tired, not just from the day but from life itself. The man's eyes were fixed on the menu, though he barely seemed to read it. The woman tapped her fingers against the table, distracted, as though her mind was elsewhere. To others, they looked like any older couple sharing a meal, but there was something fragile in the way they leaned toward one another, something unspoken in their silence. A few booths away sat a boy no older than 15. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, patched in places where fabric had torn. His sneakers were scuffed, his laces uneven, and his hands bore the small cuts of someone who had learned to work before he was old enough to call it a job. He looked younger than his age, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that came only from living without much. He studied the elderly couple with quiet interest, not out of rudeness, booze. Aired as if their presence reminded him of something he longed for but did not have. His own plate was small, just enough food to fill him for the night, but he ate slowly, savoring each bite as though he didn't know when he'd have another. The waitress moved between tables, tired but polite, her apron stained from the shift. She stopped at the couple's booth and took their order with a soft smile, though she couldn't help but notice the hesitation in their voices. The man asked about prices, his tone careful, and the woman leaned in close to him as though worried about the total. It was a small detail, something most people would miss, but the boy caught it. He didn't shift in his seat, didn't say a word, but something in him stirred. There was a weight in the room, quiet but pressing, as though invisible strings connected strangers who didn't yet know how their lives would collide. Outside, the night settled heavily over the town. Streetlights flickered, and the air was cool, carrying the smell of damp pavement. The roads were mostly empty, lined with old houses where curtains were drawn and lights were dim. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets had a way of being kept in whispers but never truly disappearing. Behind the quiet, there were struggles people didn't speak about, money that didn't stretch far enough, marriages that cracked behind closed doors, and dreams that slowly died in the silence of routine. The boy was no stranger to this. He lived it every day. At home, his world was different. His mother worked nights cleaning offices, her body worn down by years of labor. His younger siblings often went to bed before she returned, leaving him to take care of them with whatever little they had. The fridge was never full, the rent was always late, and the sound of arguments from neighbors carried through the thin walls. Still, he carried himself with quiet strength, as though determined not to let the weight crush him completely. He was accustomed to going without and being overlooked. Yet sitting in that diner, watching the couple struggle over a meal, he felt a pull inside him that he couldn't ignore. The elderly couple lived a different kind of life, though not one of comfort either. Their house stood at the edge of town, its paint peeling, its porch sinking into the earth. They had once known better years, back when they were younger, when work was steady and their bodies could endure more. Now, with age pressing down on them, they lived carefully, stretching what little they had. The husband carried guilt in his eyes, guilt for not being able to provide more, guilt for watching his wife worry over bills and groceries. She, in turn, carried her own quiet burden. the fear of losing stability, of growing old with nothing to fall back on. They did not speak of these fears aloud, but they lingered between them like a shadow. Back in the diner, the boy finished his meal and set his fork down slowly. His eyes moved again toward the couple. He didn't know their names or their story, but he knew enough. He knew what it felt like to count coins, to weigh the cost of hunger against the cost of dignity. The thought that people old enough to be his grandparents were doing the same stirred something fierce inside him. When the waitress returned with the bill, the boy reached into his pocket. His hands shook as he pulled out what little it is. The money he had, crumpled bills he had been saving for himself. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He told the waitress quietly that he wanted to pay for their meal. The waitress looked at him with surprise, her eyes softening as she nodded. The boy didn't want thanks, didn't want recognition. He simply wanted to do it, to give something back in a world that had taken too much from him already. When the couple learned what he had done, their eyes filled with something wordless. The man tried to protest, his voice breaking, but the boy only gave a small shake of his head. The woman reached for his hand, her skin paper-thin and trembling, and whispered a thank you. It was such a small act in the grand scheme of things, but it carried the weight of everything they had endured. What none of them knew in that moment was how much this simple act would change. Behind the quiet, behind the soft exchange of gratitude and humility, the world was already shifting. Someone else had taken notice. Someone whose presence in town was as rare as it was powerful. The events that would unfold in the days ahead would test everything. Morality, trust, the hidden lines between kindness and power. That fragile peace inside the diner was only the beginning. The kind of beginning that feels ordinary, yet leaves a chill in the air, hinting that life was about to unravel in ways no one could yet imagine. The morning after the boy paid for the elderly couple's meal, the sun rose over the small town in its usual quiet way. Birds chirped faintly, shop doors creaked open, and the streets carried the slow hum of routine. But inside the boy's house, the air was different. He woke to the sound of his younger brother coughing in the next room, his mother already gone for her shift, a note on the table reminding him to walk the kids to school. Their world hadn't changed overnight, not in the way fairy tales promised. The fridge was still almost empty, and the bills were still piled on the counter. Yet there was an unspoken shift in the boy's chest, a strange mix of pride and unease. He had done something small but powerful the night before, though he had no idea what it might stir. By midday, whispers began to spread. In a town that fed on gossip more than news, small stories travelled fast. A waitress had told her cousin, who told a neighbour, who told the cashier at the market, and soon everyone knew about the poor black boy who had paid for an old couple's meal. Some retold it as a heartwarming story of kindness. Others twisted it into something else entirely, a spectacle that made the boy feel exposed. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. People who had barely noticed him before now looked at him differently, some with admiration, others with quiet judgment. The attention pressed down on him like a weight he hadn't asked for. The elderly couple felt it too. That night, as they sat at their kitchen table, the woman's hands trembled as she folded a grocery list. She couldn't stop thinking about the boy's face, about the way his thin hand had slipped money onto the table without hesitation. It had reminded her of their own son, long gone now, estranged after years of silence. The husband sat with his jaw tight, staring at the peeling wallpaper. He hated that a child had to give them what he himself could no longer provide. That gesture, though kind, struck something sharp inside him. It exposed his weakness, his inability to shield his wife from the fear of running out. What should have been gratitude twisted into shame. By the second day, the story reached someone far beyond their world. A man in a tailored suit arrived in town, his car gleaming like it didn't belong on their cracked roads. He was the kind of man who carried himself as though the ground bent for him, his every step precise. He had money, connections, and a presence that drew eyes without effort. Few knew his name, fewer still his business. But when he entered a room, silence followed. He heard the story of the boy and the couple, and something in it caught his attention, not the kindness, but the desperation behind it. He saw opportunity where others saw compassion. When he showed up at the boy's front door, the house seemed to shrink under his shadow. The boy stood frozen, his younger siblings peeking from behind him. The man's smile was thin, his voice calm, but something was unsettling in the way he looked at the boy, as if studying a piece of property. He praised the boy's kindness, offered words that sounded generous, but felt rehearsed. Then came the promise: help, money, opportunity. The kind of offer that seemed too big for someone who had so little. At first, the boy didn't know what to say. He didn't trust it, but he couldn't ignore it either. Behind him, the empty fridge and unpaid bills whispered louder than his doubt. The man didn't just visit once. He returned again and again, always with the same polite smile, the same sharp eyes. Each time, he spoke not just to the boy, but to his mother, slipping into their lives like smoke. He told her he admired her son's heart, that boys like him deserved better. He hinted at jobs, scholarships, doors opening where walls had once stood. For a woman exhausted by endless work, the words sank in deep. She wanted to believe in something better for her children. Yet, beneath his polished tone, there was an edge, a sense of control. He wasn't offering charity. He was laying a claim. The boy began to feel trapped between gratitude and unease. He wanted to accept the man's help, to lift his family from the weight pressing on them, but he couldn't shake the feeling that every gift came with invisible strings. At night, he lay awake thinking of the couple in the diner, of the way kindness had started this chain of events. What had felt pure now felt tangled. He noticed how his mother's smile grew strained whenever the man left, how his siblings grew quiet around him. The house felt fuller when he visited, yet colder too. The elderly couple watched all of this unfold from the sidelines, unaware of the full extent, but sensing something was wrong. The wife, in particular, carried guilt. She had prayed for relief, for some kind of sign that life would ease, and now she wondered if that prayer had been answered in the boy's sacrifice. She saw him walking down the street with his head lower than before, his small frame bearing a weight invisible to others. Her husband grew restless, pacing at night, muttering about dignity and pride. He couldn't stand that their survival had been tied to the pity of a child, and even less that their names were now whispered through town in the same breath as charity. The tension didn't stay quiet. Rumors turned sharp. Some later, Jichbors accused the boy's family of seeking attention, of using pity for gain. Others speculated about the wealthy man's intentions, though none dared say it aloud. The town became divided, and kindness turned into suspicion. The boy couldn't escape it at school, where classmates mocked him, twisting his act of generosity into weakness. He felt anger rising inside him, anger at himself for caring, anger at the world for punishing him for doing what was right. As days passed, the man's influence deepened. He began making decisions for the family without asking, offering money in ways that felt less like gifts and more like debts. A broken appliance was replaced, groceries delivered without request, and envelopes slipped into his mother's purse. The boy started to see the pattern. Every kindness a hook, every gesture a chain. His mother's gratitude blinded her to it, but he could feel the walls closing in. The man wasn't just helping. He was owning. Inside, the boy wrestled with himself. He wanted to scream, to tell his mother to refuse, to run from the shadow that now lingered over their home. But another part of him, the part that remembered hunger, that remembered nights of cold, hesitated. He hated the man, yet he couldn't deny the relief his money brought. This conflict ate at him, darkening the once bright spark that had pushed him to help strangers. The elderly couple carried their own storm. The husband's pride turned bitter, his shame festering into resentment. He began lashing out, his words sharp even at his wife. He blamed himself, but he masked it by blaming her, by blaming the boy, by blaming anyone who reminded him of what he could no longer control. His wife tried to calm him, to remind him of the kindness they had been shown, but her voice trembled with fear. She knew what anger could grow into if left unchecked. The wealthy man, meanwhile, had his own secrets. His generosity was not born from compassion, but calculation. He had built his life on exploiting weakness, on finding those desperate enough to accept anything. In the boy, he saw not just vulnerability, but potential. A story to shape, a life to mold. He whispered promises of greatness, painting visions of a future that seemed impossible otherwise. But behind every promise was his own hunger, his own need to control, to bend others to his will. What had begun as a simple act in a diner was now a knot of pride, guilt, and manipulation. The boy's family, the elderly couple, and the man in the suit were all caught in it, their lives tangled by choices that seemed small but cut deep. The kindness that had once felt pure now bled into something darker, heavier. Every passing day tightened the threads, and though none of them could see the full picture yet, they all felt it, the slow pull toward a breaking point. The town itself seemed to sense it too. Conversations grew sharper, looks lingered longer, and attention hummed under the surface. It was as though everyone was waiting for something to snap, though no one could say what. The boy walked through it like a shadow, carrying the weight of others' expectations, others' judgments, until he could barely carry himself. What none of them knew was how close they were to the edge, how quickly the fragile balance could tip into chaos. The night it happened, the town was wrapped in an uneasy stillness. The air was heavy, thick with the kind of silence that makes every sound sharper, every movement louder. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving the streets slick and shining under the dim glow of the street lamps. The boy walked with his hood pulled tight, his sneakers damp, each step carrying him toward a place he didn't want to be. He had argued with his mother earlier, her voice cracking as she reminded him of all the man had done for them. She told him not to bite the hand that fed him, not to throw away the chance they had been given. But the boy couldn't shake the feeling that what they were being fed was poisoned, that every gesture from the man came with a price too high to pay. The man had called for him, asked him to meet at the house near the edge of town, the old place he had bought quietly, the one that stood out with its bright new locks and fresh paint among the sagging porches and broken fences. The boy knew it wasn't a request. It was an order, dressed in polite words. Something in his chest burned as he walked, a mix of anger and dread. He thought of the couple at the diner, of how simple and clean that moment had been, before everything turned heavy and twisted. He wondered if he had made a mistake that night, if kindness had been the first step into a trap. Inside the house, the man waited. The living room smelled of leather and expensive cologne, the kind of scent that didn't belong in their town. The boy stepped across the threshold and felt it immediately. The imbalance of power. The way the walls seemed to lean toward the man in the suit. He was seated in a chair, his posture straight, his gaze sharp. He smiled when he saw the boy, though the smile never reached his eyes. On the table beside him sat an envelope thick with cash. The man tapped it once with his finger and said it was time to stop questioning and start accepting. The boy's throat tightened. His hands curled into fists inside his pockets. He thought of his siblings sleeping at home, their faces thin with hunger. He thought of his mother's tired eyes, desperate for relief. But then he thought of the way the man looked at them, like they were pawns on a board he controlled. The boy shook his head, barely a whisper of defiance, and said he didn't want it anymore. The man's smile fell. His eyes darkened. The room seemed to shrink as the silence thickened. The man leaned forward, his voice low, almost soft, but laced with threat. He told the boy that no one ever walks away from a gift like his, that everything given can be taken back tenfold. He spoke of debts unpaid, of consequences that stretched far beyond the boy. His words cut deep, sharper than any blade, and the boy felt his chest tighten with rage. Something inside him snapped. What happened next blurred between instinct and desperation. The man rose suddenly, his hand reaching, not for a weapon, but for the boy's shoulder, to hold him still, to force him to listen. But the boy flinched back, his breath ragged, and his eyes darted to the heavy glass ashtray on the table. His fingers closed around it before he could think, the cold weight of it pressing into his palm. The man's grip tightened on his arm, his voice rising now, sharp and commanding. And in that single moment of fear, anger, and survival, the boy swung. The sound was sickening, a crack that echoed through the room, followed by a heavy thud as the man collapsed against the table, then slid to the floor. The boy stood frozen, his chest heaving, the ashtray still trembling in his grip. Blood spread quickly across the polished wood, dark and thick, seeping into the cracks. The man's eyes were open but glassy, his mouth slack. The boy's ears rang with the sound of his own heartbeat, drowning out everything else. He dropped, kept the ashtray, the clatter piercing the silence, and stumbled back. His stomach turned, bile rising in his throat. He hadn't meant for this. Not like this. He only wanted to get away, to make the man stop. But now the man was still, and the boy's world had shattered in an instant. His hands shook violently, streaked with blood that wasn't his. In the first rush of panic, he thought about running. He thought about leaving the body where it lay and pretending he had never been there. But his legs wouldn't move. His mind raced in every direction, colliding with the image of his mother's face, his siblings, and the couple in the diner. He imagined the whispers in town, sharper than ever, the judgment burning him alive. He imagined police lights outside their house, his family dragged into a mess they could never escape. The boy dropped to his knees beside the body, tears mixing with sweat on his face. He pressed his hands against the man's chest, as if he could undo what he had done, as if he could force life back into him. But the blood only spread wider, warm and slick under his palms. He pulled back, horrified at the sight of his stained hands. Minutes passed in a blur. He couldn't remember how long he knelt there, couldn't remember the moment he finally pulled himself to his feet. The house seemed to hum with silence, each shadow sharper than before. He staggered toward the door, every step heavy, his breath broken. The air outside hit him cold, but it didn't clear the fog in his head. He stumbled down the steps, the wet pavement reflecting the yellow glow of the streetlight. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. A window creaked open. The world kept moving as if nothing had happened, as if a life hadn't just been ended inside that house. The boy walked quickly, then faster, then broke into a run. His chest ached, his lungs burned, but he couldn't stop. Every sound felt like sirens chasing him, every shadow a witness. Back at home, he burst through the door, startling his siblings awake. They stared at him with wide eyes, their voices small, asking what was wrong. He couldn't answer. He went straight to the bathroom, scrubbing his hands under water that ran pink, then red before clearing. His reflection in the cracked mirror didn't look like his own. It was pale, wild-eyed, streaked with tears. He leaned against the sink, his body trembling so hard he thought he might fall. In the living room, his mother had returned, her tired face softening when she saw him. But her expression quickly changed when she noticed his state. His soaked clothes, his trembling frame, the faint smear of blood he hadn't managed to wash away. Her questions came fast, her voice breaking with fear. The boy shook his head, unable to find words, his throat clogged with guilt. He wanted to tell her everything, but the weight of it pressed his tongue down. Instead, he collapsed into her arms, sobbing against her chest, his body shaking as though the blood still clung to him. She held him tight, not understanding, but knowing it was something that had broken him in ways she couldn't yet name. Her heart pounded with dread, a mother's instinct telling her the truth before the words ever left his lips. Back at the house on the edge of town, the body lay still. The envelope of money remained untouched on the table, its corners stained red where blood had spread. The air inside was thick, the silence suffocating. Outside, the rain began again, tapping against the windows, washing the streets clean but leaving the inside untouched. The boy didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's face, the moment of impact, the blood. His chest felt crushed by the weight of what he had done, the unshakable knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. He had taken a life, not out of greed, not out of cruelty, but out of fear and desperation. And yet, the reason didn't matter. The act itself was enough to seal his fate. When the first light of dawn crept through the thin curtains, the boy sat at the edge of his bed, hollow and drained. His siblings slept huddled together on the floor, unaware of the storm that had been unleashed. His mother sat at the table in silence, her eyes red, her face pale. The boy knew that the world outside was already moving toward them, that whispers would soon turn to shouts, that doors would close and eyes would follow. The crime had unfolded in the space of a heartbeat, but its shadow stretched long. It clung to the walls of their home, to the boy's skin, to the town itself. And though no one yet knew the full truth, the weight of it had already begun to press down, crushing everything in its path. Morning came heavy, like a blanket of fog pressing down on the town. By then, the wealthy man's absence was already being noticed. He wasn't someone who blended in, he wasn't someone who could disappear quietly. His car remained parked outside the house on the edge of town, rain dripping down its polished hood. Neighbors began to whisper, peeking from behind curtains, wondering why his lights were still burning long past dawn. It didn't take long for someone to call. When police arrived and pushed open the door, the scene was stark. A body sprawled on the floor, the blood dried into dark stains across the polished table and carpet. The envelope still sat there, its edges warped, money peeking out like a silent accusation. The news spread faster than wildfire. By noon, the town buzzed with voices, each one carrying a different version of the story. Some said the man had enemies in business, that this was a hit, retribution. Others whispered about the boy, connecting dots they couldn't fully see, but wanted to believe in. The story of his kindness at the diner, once celebrated, was now retold with suspicion. People said no one does something like that without expecting something in return. The town that had briefly lifted him up now turned on him, twisting his image into something darker. Inside his home, the boy sat in silence, staring at his raw hands. He had scrubbed them so hard the skin had cracked, yet he still felt the stickiness of blood that wasn't there. His mother paced the kitchen, her face pale, her lips pressed tight. She asked no direct questions, but her eyes carried them all, and she wanted to protect him, to shield him from the storm outside. But a truth this heavy could not be hidden for long. She knew it, and so did he. Every knock on the door made his heart seize. Every sound from the street made him think it was over. His siblings didn't understand. They only knew their brother was different now. He didn't smile. He didn't laugh at their small jokes. He moved like someone much older, weighed down by something they couldn't see. At night he woke up gasping, his sheets soaked with sweat. He dreamed of the man's eyes, open but empty, of blood spreading across the floor. His guilt was a living thing, gnawing at him from the inside, and no matter how tightly he pressed his fists against his chest, he couldn't make it stop. The elderly couple felt the ripple too. When they heard the news of the man's death, their stomachs sank. The wife's first thought was of the boy, the way he had looked at them in the diner, the way his hand had trembled as he gave what little he had. She prayed it wasn't connected, but deep down she feared it was. The husband grew restless, his guilt curdling into paranoia, He said it was their fault, that if the boy hadn't felt the need to help them, none of this would have happened. He slammed his fist against the table, cursing himself for being weak, for being a burden. His wife tried to soothe him, but her own heart ached with the same thought. The police investigation unfolded quickly. A man of wealth and influence found dead in such a small town demanded attention. Detectives combed through the house, collecting every fingerprint, every fiber, every trace. They noted the ashtray on the floor, wiped clean but still damp, as if someone had tried to wash it hastily. They noted the boy's fingerprints scattered across the house from previous visits. When his name came up in conversation, already tangled in town gossip, the detectives circled it in red. The story of his kindness now became a piece of evidence, twisted into a motive, painted as a connection rather than a coincidence. The boy's mother tried to stay strong. She reminded him that he had acted out of fear, that he hadn't meant for it to happen, that survival sometimes pushed people into corners. She told him to keep quiet, to let her handle whatever came next. But the boy couldn't silence the voice inside him that screamed he had crossed a line he could never return from. He began to withdraw, barely eating, barely speaking. He avoided the windows, avoided the streets. He lived in shadows, even when the sun was shining. The town was divided. Some pitied the boy, seeing him as a child caught in the grip of a powerful man who had toyed with lives for too long. They whispered about the way the wealthy man had come into their town, about the strings he pulled and the debts he created. Others were unforgiving, painting the boy as a liar, a manipulator, someone who had used a simple act of kindness to climb into a rich man's world and then destroy him. Public opinion shifted daily, each new rumor bending the truth further away from reality. For the elderly couple, the burden of silence grew unbearable. The wife longed to reach out to the boy, to tell him he wasn't alone, that she still saw the heart behind his actions. But her husband refused, saying it was dare and gross that their names could get dragged into it. He was right, but the guilt ate at them both. Nights became sleepless, filled with the sound of their creaking house and the weight of their thoughts. They prayed for forgiveness, though neither knew who they were asking it from: the boy, the man, or God. The media caught hold of the story within days. Headlines screamed of a mysterious death, of a poor boy tied to a millionaire's downfall. Reporters came to the town, their cameras flashing, their voices loud as they asked neighbors for quotes. The boy's image, once private, now appeared on screens and papers. Strangers debated his life, his choices, as though they knew him. To some, he became a symbol of resistance, the underdog who struck back. To others, he was a criminal, proof that kindness hides darker motives. The boy watched it all from behind the curtains, his chest tightening with each new story. He felt himself shrinking, his voice drowned out by the noise of others defining him. He wanted to tell the truth, that it wasn't about power or greed, that it had been a moment of fear and desperation, but the words stuck. His silence became its own kind of confession. As the days stretched into weeks, the boy's family bore the weight together, though cracks began to show. His mother aged in those days, her shoulders stooped, her eyes dimmed. She worried not just about the law, but about the boy himself, about the way he was fading before her eyes. She feared he would not survive the guilt, even if the world never found out. His siblings tiptoed around him, sensing the storm, even if they didn't understand it. Their home, already fragile, became a place of tension, where every sound seemed too loud, every silence too deep. The community shifted too. The diner where it had all begun became a place of hushed voices. Some customers spoke of the boy's kindness as though it had been a mask. Others defended him, saying no one so young should carry such blame. The waitress, who had witnessed the moment firsthand, struggled with her own guilt. She replayed it over and over. Had she done something wrong by telling others? Had she set the spark that grew into a fire? Her sleep grew restless, her heart heavy with doubt. The boy lived in a constant state of waiting for the knock on the door, waiting for the truth to come crashing in, waiting for the weight to finally break him. Each day bled into the next, his world reduced to four walls and a mind that wouldn't let him rest. He was haunted not just by what he had done, but by how quickly the world had turned, how one act of kindness had spiraled into ruin. In the end, the aftermath was not just about the crime itself, but about everything it touched. A family left fractured, a town left divided, a couple left drowning in guilt, and a boy, once just another face in the crowd, now marked forever by a choice that had started as love and ended in blood. The echoes of it stretched far beyond him, a reminder that even the smallest moments can grow into storms that consume everything in their path. The trial that followed stretched on for months, the courtroom filled with reporters, curious neighbors, and strangers who had never even set foot in their neighborhood but felt entitled to witness the unraveling of lives. The boy, once admired as a symbol of kindness, now sat shackled in silence, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of his own story pressed down on him. His lawyer argued desperation, manipulation, and the crushing pressure of poverty. The prosecution painted him as someone who had crossed a line that could not be excused. The early couple's family sat behind the prosecution's table, their grief etched in every frown, every tear they refused to let fall in public. Justice for them seemed clear. But for others, watching from the gallery or following the case on the evening news, the story was not so simple. The man who had first given the boy hope, the millionaire whose generosity had once lit up headlines, kept his distance, his absence speaking louder than any words. It was said he felt betrayed, that he no longer knew if his own kindness had been twisted into something darker. Some whispered that he blamed himself for drawing too much attention to the boy in the first place, putting him on a pedestal he was never ready to stand on. Others believed he simply wanted to wash his hands of the situation, retreat into the comfort of his own wealth and privacy. Whatever the truth, his silence added another layer of sorrow to the trial. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom seemed to freeze. Guilty. The word echoed, heavy and final. The boy's mother broke down in uncontrollable sobs, her hands clutching the sides of the bench as though she might collapse. The boy himself didn't move at first. Only after a long, unbearable pause did he lift his head, his eyes empty yet burning with a quiet recognition. Life as he knew it was over. Sentencing came weeks later, sealing his fate with years behind bars. For some, this was justice. For others, it was tragedy upon tragedy. A cycle repeating itself, where kindness and cruelty became tangled, until no one could tell them apart. The community was split. Some people shook their heads, muttering that the boy had thrown away a future most could only dream of. Others defended him, pointing to a life of hardship, to the cruel pressure of being turned into a symbol rather than a human being. In quiet conversations, neighbors admitted they had once celebrated his story, but now wondered if they had projected too much onto him, expecting him to live a life free of flaws simply because he had done one kind thing. The media, once eager to splash his photo across headlines as a beacon of hope, now used the same image to tell a story of downfall and disgrace. The contrast was jarring, and the hypocrisy wasn't lost on those who cared enough to look closer. For the elderly couple's family, the loss was permanent. No trial or sentence could fill the empty chairs at their dining table or silence the ache of grief that lived in their hearts. For them, the boy's struggles, his poverty, his symbolic meaning to others, none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that their parents were gone. That simple, irreplaceable truth cut through every layer of debate and discussion. They would carry their anger forever, even as the world outside debated morality and power and justice. In prison, the boy wrestled with his own mind. He replayed the events that had led him there, the moment when everything snapped and kindness twisted into violence. Some days he convinced himself he had been manipulated, forced by circumstances too heavy for any teenager to bear. Other days, he faced the truth more plainly, that no amount of suffering excused what he had done. He thought often of the night he had paid for the couple's meal, how light he had felt then, how proud. That memory, once a beacon, had become a haunting reminder of the life he had destroyed with his own hands. The story left a mark far beyond the individuals involved. Fede. It stirred conversations about race, poverty, and the fragile line between opportunity and exploitation. People argued about whether society had failed him long before he failed himself, about how much weight should fall on a child's shoulders, especially when elevated in a world that loves heroes but abandons them when they stumble. The case forced people to confront uncomfortable truths, that kindness is not a shield, that good intentions cannot erase systemic injustice, and that human beings are far too complex to fit neatly into the roles of angel or monster. In the end, the tale of the boy who once paid for a stranger's meal became less about the act itself and more about what followed. It became a story of how fragile hope can be when placed in human hands, how quickly the line between savior and sinner blurs when pressure builds and past wounds bleed into the present. It asked questions that had no easy answers. Was justice truly served? Or was another life lost differently, swallowed by the weight of expectation and circumstance? For those who followed the story, the conclusion was not closure, but reflection. It lingered in the air, reminding anyone who heard it that kindness, while powerful, does not exist in a vacuum. It is tangled in the mess of human lives, shaped by struggles, temptations, and hidden battles no one else can see. And as people walked away from the courtroom, or turned off the evening news, or set down the newspaper, they were left with the uneasy truth that the story had not ended. It had only shifted. The boy lived on, behind bars, carrying the weight of both his brightest moment and his darkest hour. The couple lived on only in memory, their absence heavy in the hearts of those who loved them. And society, watching from the outside, was left to wrestle with its own reflection in the tragedy.